We'll begin then. So good evening, everyone. Hope you're all doing well and safe. Thank you for joining us this evening for our discussion on criminalizing fake news implications for Sri Lankan society. I'm Sumaya Saleh and I will be your moderator this evening. This discussion is hosted by Sri Lanka Students for Liberty in collaboration with the Nightwatchman Society. Students for Liberty is a rapidly growing network of pro-liberty students from all over the world. Their mission is to educate, develop, and empower the next generation of leaders of liberty. And they take pride in themselves as the largest pro-liberty student organization in the world. This is accomplished through a strategy of empowerment, identifying the top student leaders and training them to be agents of change in their communities. The Nightwatchman Society is the official Bastiat Society chapter in Sri Lanka. They are a meetup group that hosts monthly meetings, alternating between a public discussion and a book club to explore critical ideas related to economics, individual freedom, and an open society. For today's discussion, we are joined with our speakers. Our first speaker is Gehan Gunatillake, who is a lawyer specializing in human rights and constitutional law and a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School. He is also a visiting lecturer at the Center for Study of Human Rights at the University of Colombo. His research currently focuses on freedom of expression and the relationship between identity politics, constitutional discourse, and ethno-religious violence in Sri Lanka. Gehan is also a founding partner at Lex AG, a law firm based in Colombo, Sri Lanka. He has a PhD in law from the University of Oxford and an LLM from Harvard Law School. Our second speaker for today is Bhavani Fonseka, who has an LLB honors from the University of Bristol, an LLM from the University of Denver, and MPA Harvard. She is a senior researcher and attorney at law at Center for Policy Alternatives with a focus on research, national and international advocacy, and public interest litigation. Her work has revolved around assisting victims and affected populations across Sri Lanka, legal and policy reforms, and public interest litigation. She is the editor of the book Transitional Justice in Sri Lanka, Moving Beyond Promises. Our third speaker for today, Roel Raymond, who is the editor-in-chief of Raw Media, part of Raw Global, a South Asian media organization. She has worked with both public and private media and with print, radio, television, and online formats. She is a breaking news journalist and most active on Twitter, and she has reported live during emergency situations for CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, Vox, and many more. She has previously served as online editor at Daily News and head of news for EFM. Our fourth speaker for today, Imran Furkan, who is the former CEO of Sri Lanka Association for Software Services Companies, which is the national chamber for the knowledge and innovation industry in Sri Lanka. He is also the former CEO of Sri Lanka Press Institute and former non-executive independent director of Trade Finance and Investments PLC. Imran is passionate about one thing, and that is collaboration by connecting people together, fostering industry partnerships, and advising on macro, socio-economic, and technological strategy. I warmly welcome you all today. And just before we start our discussion, I would like to remind our audience that you can send in your questions by utilizing the Zoom Q&A box or by commenting on the Facebook live stream if you're joining through there. So to start off with a little bit of context as to the current situation in Sri Lanka on fake news, there have been considerations made to introduce fake news as an offense under the Penal Code. The Cabinet has sanctioned the concept paper, and there is an expert committee looking into it. However, some organizations such as the Free Media Movement oppose this idea. We will be discussing more about this, as well as the international perspective and the effect that fake news has on journalists and media, and finally how it is technologically possible to self-regulate the spread of fake news and the ordinary citizens to voice their opinions and whether it is a threat to freedom of expression. And now to start off our discussion, I would like to first ask Gehan to tell us about the international legal perspective on fake news with emphasis on freedom of expression. Over to you, Gehan.
Thanks. Can I be heard clearly? Just give you a thumbs up. Yep. All right. Thanks. So thanks very much for a very kind introduction and this invitation to speak on a very important topic. And in the next 15 minutes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to touch on three aspects of the debate on criminalizing fake news. First, I'm going to ask the question, what is free speech and why is it important? Then I'm going to try and deconstruct this idea of fake news and what it really entails. And finally, I'm going to ask why we need to be restrained when it comes to criminalizing fake news in Sri Lanka. So let's start with the first question. Let's ask ourselves, what does free speech actually mean? Now, we have a tendency to present a caricature of this value, free speech. Oh, free speech is the freedom to offend and insult people. Or free speech is the freedom to lampoon or make fun of our public figures. Well, yes, free speech does entail some of those things, but it's a mistake to reduce the value of free speech to those things alone. Free speech, or the freedom of expression, is not a particularly glamorous thing. It's essentially, think of it as the engine oil that lubricates the engine of democracy. Your right to vote, to convey an opinion, to receive information, to receive reasons for a decision by an authority, to organize associations, to express yourself in art, in song, in dance, theater, film, to hold a government to account. All these very ordinary day-to-day activities tied to your citizenship are founded on the premise that you have the freedom to express yourself. So there is no democratic society without freedom, and there is certainly no freedom without free speech. It's as simple as that. So much of the international human rights law that we're accustomed to is founded on this idea. So the debate is ultimately about what we value in a society like Sri Lanka. And there are plenty of societies out there, and some of them are actually doing fairly well, economically speaking, that are not founded on freedom. And we can have that debate as to whether freedom is essential for human flourishing or not. But that's a separate debate. And we're not having that debate today. The discussion today, I imagine, is premised on the understanding that we are committed to democracy and freedom. So that's why I want to begin by suggesting that the engine grinds to a halt if you deprive it of engine oil. Democracy cannot function without free speech. So we have to bear that in mind when we start discussing fake news. And I'm going to now get to the second aspect of the debate. What is fake news and how is it relevant to free speech? Now, fake news is unfortunately a terribly unhelpful term because it actually means a lot of things. It certainly isn't confined to traditional media content alone because now every user is a source of news. So those traditional boundaries have broken down. But let's remember, we're talking about criminalizing, right? So that's the topic today. Criminal sanctions should only be applied when the harm caused by the activity concerned is actually very serious. It's very intense. So the very question, should we criminalize fake news is extremely troubling because it fails to understand that fake news can entail a lot of things. So I want to try and break this down, and I'm going to use a diagram. Let me try and share my screen very quickly. Hopefully it'll work. Can you see my screen? Just give me a thumbs up. All right, so let's assume that this is the universe of fake news, right? Within that universe, you have fake news that's actually very harmful, and we call that disinformation. And you have fake news that is not particularly harmful, and we call that misinformation. Now, disinformation typically can involve anti-vax campaigns. You've seen it around the world. They're really harmful because you're actually trying to compel or coerce people not to take vaccines in the midst of a pandemic. the type of disinformation that we saw during Brexit and during the presidential election in 2016 that was meant to undermine elections. Now, uh, this type of content that's harmful really needs to be countered. And typically you would counter it through fact checking or through discrediting the source of the disinformation. Whereas by contrast, fake news that isn't harmful, like for example, a discussion on whether the Loch Ness monster exists, it's not particularly harmful, and you could either ignore it or counter it if you have the time. But within the sphere of harmful fake news, which is disinformation, there are types of fake news that we need to be mindful of. One is the type of disinformation that encourages discrimination. Like, for example, the types of disinformation that says that a particular minority group is mixing sterilization pills in their restaurants and it's causing mothers to be sterile, potential mothers to be sterile. That kind of disinformation is extremely harmful, and the state has a duty to counter it. And I'm going to argue that still the means through which the state counters such disinformation ought to be non-criminal, or non-criminal sanctions should be used. And I'll explain why. Then you have the sort of fake news that unfairly or illegitimately accuses someone of a crime. Particularly in this day and age, someone is accused of being a terrorist, or someone's accused of something awful, like the Dr. Shafi case. And in those cases of false allegations, the state has a duty to act with restraint, not to actually act on the fake news or disinformation, and not actually arrest those people arbitrarily. And then you have the type of fake news that incites violence. And we're familiar with that, particularly in the Sri Lankan context, these rumors that go around that, oh, there's a community now preparing to attack another community and we should be proactive, we should preempt it by attacking them first. It's a typical sort of disinformation that you have as a precursor to mob violence. And I'm going to argue that the state has a duty to counter such fake news through criminal sanctions. But take a moment to actually absorb this illustration. As you can see, and I'm going to stop sharing now, as you can see that the actual sphere of fake news is quite complex, and there's a variety of false content that falls within the universe of fake news. And not all of such content should be criminalized. In fact, only a very small portion of it should be criminalized. So that's another thing to bear in mind when we talk about criminalizing fake news. It's almost a sort of non-starter of a conversation without actually getting into the details and breaking down what fake news actually entails. So this brings me to the third aspect of the debate. I want to ask the question, why should we be restrained when it comes to criminalizing fake news? The simple answer is that freedom, and therefore democracy, will be irreversibly harmed if we attempt to criminalize all types of fake news. I want to refer to the international legal standards in this regard, because there's a very important distinction that we have to bear in mind between interference or restriction and criminalizing. So criminalization is a very specific type of restriction, but not all types of restrictions involve criminalizing. And the international legal standards and international law provide states with a lot of space to apply sanctions on false expressions that harm people. That's disinformation. And I want to begin with Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Paragraph 3 of that article permits the state to restrict speech on grounds of national security, public order, public health, so like the pandemic, for example, based on the rights and reputations of others. So that's an extremely broad authority to restrict speech. And one could easily justify restricting disinformation on any of those grounds. But here's the catch. Restriction does not necessarily mean criminalization. So let's take an example of one particular aspect of disinformation where it harms the reputation of others. And we call this defamation, right? The UN Human Rights Committee, which is the treaty body tasked with supervising the implementation of that particular covenant, specifically observes that states should not criminalize defamation, and the penalty for defamation should never be imprisonment. So this suggests that criminalization should only be reserved for the kinds of disinformation that are extremely harmful. And the singular justification for such restraint is that criminalization will have an extremely chilling effect on free speech. And we recall that free speech is absolutely essential for a working democracy. Now, let me take an example from close by, Malaysia. This is precisely why Malaysia's fake news law, which was passed in 2018, was heavily criticized. And subsequently, the parliament actually repealed that law. Malaysia has unfortunately just passed a new temporary law to prohibit so-called fake news in the context of COVID-19. And that's receiving a lot of criticism as well. So apart from criminalization, there are alternatives. And we have to ask the question, what are the kinds of alternative sanctions that can be imposed? Well, you could consider a variety of non-criminal sanctions. For example, you could have licensing regimes on broadcasters, and most countries actually have that. You could have takedown orders where the harmful content is ordered to be removed. You could have disciplinary action, particularly if the fake news perpetrator is a state employee. So there are a number of responses that the state can undertake within the boundaries of international law to counter disinformation, but criminal sanctions is rarely one of those measures. So criminalizing fake news in general is not aligned or compatible with international law. And in essence, our own anti-fake news offense under Section 98 of the Police Ordinance is incompatible with international law. Actually, this conversation about fake news and a new fake news law is sometimes a little incongruous, because fake news is technically already illegal under the Police Ordinance, and that particular section is rarely used, and I'm almost afraid to even refer to that section in case it is used. But criminalizing a particular type of disinformation, I think, should be considered when it involves incitement to violence. And international law points in that direction as well, because Article 20 of the same covenant, the ICCPR, prohibits the advocacy of hatred that constitutes incitement to violence, discrimination, or hostility. And Sri Lanka's own law, the ICCPR Act, which is now abused routinely, is modeled. Now, this actually authorizes states to criminalize a certain type of incitement. So for instance, where the disinformation also encourages others to commit acts of violence, and we see that a lot, the state has a very specific duty to prosecute the perpetrators. But criminalization has to be confined to that narrow space within the overall sphere of fake news. Because ultimately, when we talk about criminal sanctions, we are talking about something very, very serious, something irreversible. The repercussions can't be reversed very easily when you criminalize something. We're often talking about putting people in jail for their actions. And that kind of punishment can't be taken lightly. So when we entrust the state with that kind of power to put people behind bars for what they say, we better be sure that the harm involved is actually very significant. And most importantly, we have to be sure that we can trust the state to act in good faith, because we're trusting it not to exceed its authority to end up punishing people for content that isn't particularly harmful, and particularly content that is valuable, like criticism of government. And we're starting to see that in a lot of contexts, including Sri Lanka. So I want to end with the point on trust. And this is at the heart of the question I'm raising. Why should we be restrained when it comes to criminalizing fake news? If we place more power in the state that we cannot trust, it will end up damaging free speech, which is crucial to hold the state to account and preserve our democracy. And you cannot trust a state with more power to criminalize speech when the state has a proven track record of suppressing free speech and applying criminal speech laws in total bad faith. And I'm sure Bhavani will delve into the details, but the Sri Lankan state has abandoned any moral authority to enhance the domain of criminal law on fake news. That conversation is actually absurd in a context where the existing laws are routinely abused. Journalists have been arrested, lawyers have been arrested, politicians have been arrested, artists and writers have been arrested, ordinary citizens have been arrested for legitimately exercising their free speech. And don't misunderstand my point as an indictment on the current government. Don't forget it was under the previous government, the so-called Yahapalana government, that Shaktika Satkumara and Dr. Shafi were arrested. So we have a serious problem of good faith when it comes to state authority and not just governmental authority to restrict free speech, which brings me to the point I raised at the beginning. If we actually value freedom and democracy, we must do everything to preserve its lifeblood, free speech. And when we know that international standards are very clear on the subject, and we have every reason to distrust the state based on its history and based on contemporary practice, the conversation on criminalizing fake news, for me, is a non-starter. I'll just pause there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gehan. That was certainly an interesting overview of the international perspective. I would now like Bhavani to tell us about the implications of criminalizing of fake news in Sri Lanka. Bhavani?
Thank you, Sumaya, and thank you to the organizers for this very timely conversation. We, I think a couple of weeks ago, heard about this cabinet approval of criminalizing fake news. And as far as I know, we haven't seen what that entails and what language they're looking at. So in a way, we are having the broader conversation of what the implications are and what we should be looking at. And I think it's very important, I mean, from Gehan's introduction to this in terms of understanding in the Sri Lankan context, what criminalizing fake news can mean, but also the large issue of threats to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And unfortunately, Sri Lanka has had decades of experiences where there's been various measures used to shrink that space. So, you know, what are we looking at? We are looking at a situation where if there are new laws imposed, new criminal measures brought in addition to what we already have, and I'll speak to some of what we already have in place because the practice of how it has been used. This, in the absence of clarity, we are in for extremely dire times because we are going to have a situation where media, critics, and others who may have a different opinion could be targeted, could be weaponized. And by actually introducing a law, we actually also need to recognize that they're actually going to be normalizing a particular practice, legitimizing a particular practice. So we can have all these debates, but when there is something in terms of a law, for many, there is this acceptance that it's okay. We have the law, we are going to implement this. So what we could be in for in terms of new laws is this kind of acceptance, legitimizing, normalizing a potential weapon that could be used in terms of targeting critiques, targeting even some of us here, the media, those who, and we've seen this in the past, writers, poets, those who may put even a Facebook post. So that's the reality. Now, in terms of fake news, I think we need to also realize when we talk about misinformation, disinformation, and as Gehan pointed out, not everything is wrong. You know, this is in terms of recognizing pluralism, in terms of the freedom we have to exchange ideas, to have debates. And so it's a balancing notion of a robust debate, having robust ideas, and in terms of what is malicious, what could do damage. So that balancing is extremely important in terms of when we have these conversations. So the impact is potentially very serious, but also we need to understand that there should be space for us to have these kind of conversations, to agree to disagree, and not be worried about what those consequences, repercussions would be. So just having something, some ideas, or writing something that could offend, that could shock someone, doesn't mean it should be criminalized, that it should be used to target and to stop those discussions from happening. So that's something very important in terms of keeping in mind the the present conversations, that it's important to recognize people have different perspectives, different points of views. The Supreme Court of Sri Lanka has recognized the need to be able to criticize the state, the officials, and have that vibrant debate. And the state, the government, should not be the ones who come and say this is wrong now. So that's kind of keeping in mind what we should be considering when we have these conversations. Now, we do have a whole spate of laws, and I've been told not to make it too legal, so I won't make it legal, but I will make the point that the Constitution recognizes freedom of speech and expression. That is clearly articulated in Article 14.1a. There are also restrictions that is there. So that's also provided in the Constitution. And one particular issue in terms of the restrictions is that it has to be prescribed by law. So we cannot just have the IGP or a minister or someone saying this is wrong, we're going to arrest. That's not the premise of this. So there can be restrictions. It needs to be clearly articulated by law. And we saw this example last year when the IGP actually made a press release saying you cannot critique officials for doing what they're doing during the COVID pandemic, but raising the question, what is the law that was being used? But I'll go into some of this in a bit. But there has to be legal certainty in terms of the restrictions imposed. But unfortunately in Sri Lanka, if you look at some of the laws we have, even the legal framework is problematic and how it's implemented. So this is a very important point. We could have the legal framework, we have the norms, but also implementation is critical. So when we're talking about a potential criminalizing of fake news, we need to factor in where it's coming from, what's informing such conversations, what is likely to be in a potential bill, the terms that are going to be used, whether it's going to be broad, whether it would be so vague that it leaves a lot of scope for those individuals deciding, and that could lead to abuse. And then how it's going to be implemented. And a key point I will raise is the fact who is going to be having the oversight of a potential law as well. So those things are going to be unpacked as much as I can when I speak about this. But when we talk about the law, so we have the Constitution framework, we have the Fundamental Rights Chapter, we also have provisions in the Penal Code, we have provisions, the ICCPR Act, we used to have emergency regulations, which had some implications on this. We don't have emergency at the moment, but there were several laws that provided for some aspects on the topic we're talking about. We also have the Computer Crimes Act, which has been used in the past to arrest individuals. Ramzi Razik is an example where the Computer Crimes Act has been used to arrest, detain individuals. So there's a plethora of laws that can be used in terms of addressing the disinformation, the misinformation that's out there. But I would also make the case with these laws, the problem is that how it's interpreted and how it's used. And this is where the problem lies. We've had instances in the past, such as the case of Tresync, who was a journalist who was arrested in 2008. He was prosecuted and convicted under the PTA. So the Prevention of Terrorism Act is a tool that has been used to target, to weaponize individuals, minorities, critics over the decades. So it's not a new phenomenon. We have seen that being used for some. And so Tissa was arrested, prosecuted, convicted for something he wrote during the war in 2008, and an instance where he spoke about what happened in Wahare. Now, this was seen as something, the state came out and spoke about and prosecuted him on the basis that this was causing disharmony, communal tensions, all of that. And it set this very chilling effect in terms of journalists, in terms of anyone writing or voicing an opinion that was against the official position of the state. And Tissa's case, he was pardoned later, but Tissa's case is a good example of how laws can be used to target journalists, to target critics. Now, since in the post-war setting, we've also had several other instances where individuals have been targeted for having a different point of view, for expressing a particular point of view that could be seen as unpopular by the powers that be. Now, last year we saw the arrest or detention of Ramzi Razik under the ICCPR Act and the Computer Crimes Act. We also have a poet, Ahnaf, who's been in detention for over a year now. None of these cases, I would say, from what I've seen, raises the question of something criminal. These are people who post something on Facebook or write something, be it a novel. So Shaktika's case raises the whole issue of he wrote a fiction, and for that he was charged under the ICCPR Act. So we have several instances where for writing something, for posting something on Facebook or on social media, people have been targeted using the existing framework. We also had instances, say for example, in 2018 with the Digana violence and Easter Sunday subsequent ethno-religious violence that happened, where there was fake news. I mean, we do recognize there was this kind of false information spreading, and the government of the day had to take action in terms of shutting down social media platforms, and in that sense, taking measures to at least prevent violence from spreading. Now, what we also saw at that time was there were many people who were arrested, both in 2018 and 2019 and other instances as well. But none of those, as far as I'm aware, have led to prosecutions. Now, there is then this question of who decides to prosecute, on what basis that prosecution happens. Is there an arbitrary nature in terms of those decisions? So the implementation of a law is also extremely critical. And even when there's evidence, and this has been raised by some of us, when there is evidence that even popular figures, leaders of particular communities are spreading false information, there is really no action taken. Or there's a token arrest happening or a token statement made, but really there is no action taken on particular individuals. So are we using even what we have as a weapon, as something to target those who are not seen as aligning with what the state feels or the government of the day feels is the official position? So that's where it is. In 2020, during the pandemic, I mentioned there were a spate of arrests. The acting IGP came out and said, you cannot critique officials for doing their duty. The Human Rights Commission came out very strongly and said this is unconstitutional. And there's sufficient Supreme Court jurisprudence that shows that one can critique the government, that criticism is essential for a democracy, essential in terms of respecting fundamental rights and freedoms. So we have a whole spate of Supreme Court judgments that ensures there has to be space, there has to be safeguards. But in this context where we've had arrests, we were not clear in terms of what the law, how it's being implemented, we now have this conversation about criminalizing fake news. That's what the state is saying. But as Gehan also mentioned, this is not something new. So we need to recognize that successive governments have tried to bring in laws for their own political convenience to address a particular need of the day. But there's been initiatives in the past that have attempted to bring in laws that can be very repressive. So in terms of fake news, there was an instance in 2015. Some of us challenged this when amendments were brought for the Penal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code, which was extremely problematic because the terminology was very broad. So we said it could lead to abuse. And the Attorney General in court agreed to withdraw, and the government withdrew that bill. In 2019, soon after the Easter Sunday attacks, there was also an attempt by the government to bring in an amendment to the Penal Code. Again, language which is so broad that the question was, how do you classify false news? So let's be very clear. The attempt now is not something that's happened in a vacuum. We've had previous governments also trying to do it. So the question is, this is not just this government attempting it, we've had it in the past. So we need to ask the political leadership, why is this happening? And how the implementation is so arbitrary. So those things I would say are very important to keep in mind when we have this conversation. Our own past, problems and arbitrary nature of implementation. But in terms of, and I want to say this, I'm not proposing that there be new laws. We have existing laws. But if this conversation moves, and there is, and we've seen in the past, there's difficulty in terms of informing legislation, the process is problematic. But I think if there is a moment in terms of taking this forward, I think we need to keep in mind of some key elements. Clear definitions are important. Precise language is key. Ensuring that implementation also, so it's not just drafting a law, it's also the implementations. Are the investigators, prosecutors, judges aware of standards, aware of the importance of freedoms, the importance of democracy, all of that. So laws that need to be clear, precise, implementation that has to really address the rights and not lead to a further weaponizing. But an important point that we don't talk about a lot is oversight. Who is going to have oversight of such measures? And we look to the judiciary in a lot of respects. As lawyers, we do that. But I think we also need to ask our own elected representatives. Parliament should have a say in these matters. They should be asking difficult questions of the executive arm. So there has to be different aspects that are looked into. And I know my time is up, but one final point is, and this was made before, is that it's not just the legalese and the legal framework. As lawyers, I think we look to that, but it's also engaging in a multi-pronged approach to have these discussions. So involving not just and targeting not just the state and the government, but also engaging with social media platforms of private sector, of media entities, in terms of ensuring there's fact checks, there's awareness, there's better digital literacy, all of those things. And hopefully we get into this, because there's just different elements, not just the criminalizing aspect, but also the practical aspect that requires attention. So I'll leave it at that, and thank you.
Thank you, Bhavani, for providing case examples as well for better understanding. In this day and age where digital media is rapidly developing, there are a lot of effects that fake news has on news and media. Roel, could you tell us more about the perspective of news and media when it comes to fake news being criminalized and the possibility of it being used to target journalists and the media? Roel.
Hi, Sumaya, thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you. Thanks for having me on. Thanks for having this discussion. And I think more importantly, thank you for getting the point of view of the media, because this could very easily be a discussion amongst people who have legal expertise. But I think involving the media in a conversation like this is quite important. And I'll explain why, because besides what Bhavani and Gehan brought up, in terms of limitations of on freedom of expression, and using and weaponizing these various legislations against citizens and against people who spread, whether knowingly or unknowingly, because as we know, fake news, we are taught in the media that fake news can be broadly separated into 3 categories, and that's misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation. Of course, like Gehan pointed out, this is very broad. These are very broad categories. There's a lot that goes on within this sort of ecosystem of fake news. And like what Bhavani pointed out, the fact that there's no very clear definition of what constitutes fake news is a problem area. And not just in the cabinet paper that's been brought up this time, but in 2019, I think at that time, Ranjit Madhuma Bandara was the minister who brought it up. The same thing was brought up, and at that point, I think the way they classified it was, even this time, it's disseminating fake news. So that in itself tells you they're not looking at perhaps the creators of fake news or where it's coming from, just the dissemination is where the focus is. And even last time it was dissemination, false news distribution, and hatred statements, whatever that is supposed to mean. So my point is, besides the fact that there is no clarity on definition, and I agree with Bhavani, definition has to be very, very, very precise. And besides the other things like intent, which is what Gehan alluded to when he was saying that there needs to be trust, whatever government is in place, there needs to be trust that the state will use this with the right intentions. Besides all of this, from a news point of view, from somebody who's representing the media, this fake news thing, I think I bring a very different point of view here, because as the media, what we deal with is information. And what we do is we commodify and we sell information. That's what all of us do. It's a business at the end of the day. And we may sell it for something as little as 30 rupees a broadsheet, or 50 rupees a broadsheet, or whatever. That's what the news will go for in terms of like when you're selling a newspaper, or for like minimal cost if you're getting your news digitally. But while we retail it for that price, information has high value. The information we work with has high value, and that is why this boils down to, when you look at it from within the news ecosystem, it boils down to a matter of ownership, which is something we have discussed very at great length within the media industry, and it's also something many other people have brought up, people who are interested in how media works. Verite Research 2 years ago did a very interesting research on media ownership and who owns the media. And for people who don't know, it's just a Google search away. If you Google it, you will find out which families own the media, how small the ecosystem really is. And you'll also see that all of this, the ownership is also very closely linked to political, either political parties or political families, or in at least one case, a politician himself. So when we talk about ownership, we're then talking the ownership of media, we're also talking about agenda setting right at the outset. So when we say fake news from a media point of view, I'm not even looking at fake news as something that spreads on social media, created by random people. I'm talking about fake news that is news that is manipulated, or PR bits, or news that is printed in newspapers where certain facts have been omitted, or with a certain spin or an agenda. And if you look at it that way, then the media in Sri Lanka is dealing with fake news. So where is in this great attempt to criminalize fake news, where are they even looking at the people who are very often purveyors of fake news and very often closely aligned with political powers that be? So again, this is not me saying that the criminalization needs to change focus and start looking at the media, because I am, at the outset, I'll say I'm against the criminalization, because it doesn't, it's not a solution to the problem. The problem is that fake news, besides being just disseminated or shared by troublemakers, fake news is a part of the news industry. And offering us criminalizing is not going to offer a solution, because there's absolutely no guarantee that the legislation that's going to be passed, or will be passed, or may not even be passed, will be indiscriminately used against people, against anyone. It will be used in a very discriminate manner. It will be used against people who say things against whatever powers that be at that point. And this is something that has happened, like Bhavani pointed out, for decades. It's not something new. Existing laws have been used against journalists, have been used against dissenting voices, to the degree that the media today is in a very vulnerable place. There is no robust media, there is no independent media. I would like to actually at this point very gratefully point out that I do belong to one independent news media organization, but we don't deal with news in the way that an ordinary news organization deals with. We try to give a sort of broader perspective, and we try to make it more about education and impact, which is why perhaps we've escaped in a sense. But where the media stands today in Sri Lanka is at a very vulnerable point. And the way I see it, again, like I said, criminalizing is not going to be the solution. The solution is then to start looking at what can be done from within the media industry itself. And that goes back to, again, this is not new. This is something that has been debated again for decades, where the media industry itself has been trying to sort of figure out a way that they can regulate or self-regulate. And I can't say that they've done a very good job, because the only sort of self-regulatory body is the Press Complaints Commission, and that is geared very much to broadsheets. The Press Complaints Commission does not know how to even deal with the online space. It doesn't talk about broadcast. As we know, television has the highest, the largest slice of media share in Sri Lanka, and everybody, most watch television. So when television channels are so closely aligned with political agendas and are already spreading fake news, which we saw happening, and manipulated news and news that is far from the truth, then at which point and how? I mean, it's very clear that this criminalization of, or proposed criminalization of fake news is eyewash. It's not going to be used against the people who actually create fake news or spreads fake news. It's very clear that it's going to be used against any dissenting voices, or as a example to, you take down somebody and then everybody's afraid about what. I mean, if you actually look at it, it's a tool that's going to be used to suppress the public. It's going to be citizens who are going to be afraid to post something. It will be citizens who are taken, who are hauled off and who are arrested. And people in general start being very careful about what they say online, what they say on social media, because they're afraid of what these laws will do. And that in itself is limiting every kind of freedom, and the most important kind of freedom, which is freedom of expression, as Gehan explained, is the lubricant or the engine, oil on which the engine of democracy runs. So my contention here is, rather than, I mean, I'm not even looking at the legal aspect because that's not my area, but looking at it from the media's point of view and coming from the media industry, where I'm very aware of the fact that a lot of the fake news is already within the industry or being created within the industry. My way of looking at it would be, the one thing I will agree with is that news websites need to be registered. That much I will agree with, because that way, people will know which news websites are actually to be trusted. But besides that, I think it's a bunch of things. There are a few stakeholders involved. So it's media literacy. Public needs to be taught how to figure out what information whether the information they're getting is actually from the right sources, whether it's accurate. And this doesn't mean having like an in-depth knowledge of all the news that's going on and keeping on top of the news cycle. But there are little pointers that you can be taught. And I know that there's been a huge investment in media literacy. Many people are investing very deeply in sort of ensuring that not just the people in the media industry, but also the public begins to understand how to differentiate between news that is blatantly false and news that is not. And you don't even have to assess the news or the content itself. You need to assess, in the first place, the place that it's coming from. So we're talking about trust then. So we need to talk about media organizations building trust. So for that you need, brand loyalty, taking pride in your brand, the kind of news you provide. These are the things that need to be worked on, and also maybe coming up with some kind of, we need some sort of oversight, definitely. But what that oversight is, what kind of regulation, these are things that the media industry has not been. I'm very new into these discussions, but many of the older journalists, the editors guilds, people who have already been in this space have not yet been able to come up with a solution to how to offer oversight or how to regulate the media space. And that's something that definitely needs to be discussed. But to sort of sum it up, again, very clearly, criminalization is not the way to go. And I see the problem as being far deeper, because the new fake news and manipulated news exists within the media industry itself, and not so much outside.
All right. Thank you, Roel, for providing us perspective on the media. With the development of technology, there may be certain challenges faced in tackling fake news. Imran, could you tell us more about how the upcoming law will cover fake news through technology and its effectiveness in tackling fake news and possible ramifications?
Thanks for having me. Look, we cannot. I really cannot, comment on the legislation until we have a look at the draft. And even when we have a look at the draft that ends up in Parliament and then goes through the committee station, gets enacted, could be something completely different. So I think let's leave aside, trying to comment on something that we have not seen. But in terms of effectiveness, that's, I think, something we can look at from a global perspective, right? When it comes to the impact that local laws can have on some of the bigger digital players, some are more equal than others. Best example would be how quickly the government of India has been able to take down certain tweets and others, while other legitimate governments from different parts of the world, some considered very powerful, have been unable to take down content that has been critical of it. Right? So technology is a beast that trying to contain, in my view, is really foolhardy. And I think smart governments should not really look at that as a way that they can control. The reality is that the big digital media giants will only listen to the laws that are applicable in the country that they are registered in, so the US. And if you look at how one state, California, has been able to impose its values, particularly data privacy on these platforms around the world, right? Shows you the imbalance in terms of how much of these digital platforms will recognize in terms of law, right? I was just looking at, I've been following from recently the Facebook page of Ranjan Ramanayake, a very interesting actor, politician. He's in prison, but the kind of post that his page keeps putting leaves me, quite confounded as to how any government thinks that they can really control, the views of someone that comes out through domestically based legislation. Also, if you look at the countries, about 20 countries have these laws criminalizing fake news, right? And a lot of them have come in the last 5 years, and there's a lot of impact from one country to another. So, for example, Singapore's law has been a basis for a lot of other countries like even Nigeria, Ghana, and then you look at Indonesia that has come up with a law as well, right? And if you look at how those laws have been used, particularly in terms of Singapore, right? Out of I think what 70 odd enforcement of actions, half of it has been against one blogger who is based in Australia. He's a Singaporean Australian gentleman that they seem to find very offensive. And then they've gone after a lot of other minor players, right? So I think I allude to the fact that I actually agree to the fact what Roel is saying, that these laws come into as a shock, to the system to try to create fear, as opposed to really being something that you can use to criminalize fake news. So in terms of technology, I don't think the domestic law is going to have much impact in terms of actually, from a global perspective, just laugh it off, right? And even Singapore, where the regional headquarters of these giants are Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. You name them, has enacted this law in 2019, right? It was very clearly enacted very close to the general election, which I was observing, right? What happened was, for the government itself, there was more of a backlash. The PAP performed worse than they've ever done in terms of the election. So it didn't seem to have an impact on the kind of discourse that the public was having. They were determined to go and make sure that the opposition had a vote, had a voice in parliament. It had no impact, and I think Indonesia as well. The impact from political discourse perspective has not been there, but it's been very chilling in terms of civil society and very small actors, right? So from a domestic perspective, I think it will have little or no impact, because we don't even register in terms of revenue or impact in these global giants. And why has technology been such an important player? Is that in the past, the control of information and voices have been through one or two, very control mechanisms, the state control media or media players whose, financial interests are aligned, or even political interests are aligned with the regime in place. Today, I think anybody can be a broadcaster, and I think that's what scares governments around the world, right? And the Palestinians and Israelis have been fighting with each other, since the creation of Israel, or even earlier. But this particular confrontation seems to have another dimension, because the Palestinians are able to kind of voice out their stories, and the digital giants which used to filter that through the CNNs of this world, the BBCs of this world, even the Al Jazeeras of this world that had agendas aligned to whatever countries they were from, are not being able to filter out the kind of narrative that is coming out of Palestine, of that region, simply because of the fact that there has been there is an individualized broadcasting mechanism put in place by technology, and it's beautiful. It's empowering. It's beautiful, and I'm extremely hopeful that technology is going to be the solution. But ultimately, as a historian of technology said, right, technology is neither left wing, right wing, nor even neutral, right? Technology is pretty much agnostic, and how you use that technology will determine the kind of outcomes that we're going to have, right? And that's where I think we should work in terms of tackling fake news, right? Biases, tribalism is why fake news is taking on such a big role in our society today, right? I was shocked to notice that even some activists among us that we know very well who talk about fake news or human rights themselves have their own biases, right? There is someone whose social media feed keeps blaming China for COVID from the beginning of last year, and he's on every panel you can think of. He's part of fact-checking operations. So I mean, our tribalism is what is leading us to to kind of subscribe and give these fake news advice. I think that's something that we need to tackle more than anything else. And the third thing I really want to talk about is how do you respond to this law? I mean, it's very nice that we have these conversations, but on the ground, to defeat this law, you need to take critical, really meaningful actions, right? And that is where I really like to address my response. I think the first thing we need to understand is we need to have an alternative to the law that is being put in place. Now, in the early 2000s, the media industry was successful in getting defamation decriminalized. And one of the reasons why they were successful, at least the print media, which was dominant at the time, was because they had an alternative mechanism that they took to policymakers and said, hey, we have this a press complaints commission, this industry-led body, we are going to have that in place when you remove when you decriminalize defamation. The government at the time may have been a little bit more, how shall I say, open to this kind of persuasion than what it is today. But the stakeholders don't have alternative mechanism, right? The European Union has this beautiful set of principles that they came up in 2018, which some of the countries are using. I think that could be a benchmark in terms of what we can do to address this issue, because you simply can't say that we shouldn't criminalize fake news, and there's enough of laws to address it, as Gehan and Bhavani have mentioned. But at the same time, you need to come up with an alternative to win public hearts. And I think that's something that those who are against this fake news need to work on. That's one aspect of it. The second one is a very unsavory one, but something that we need to subscribe to, which is we need to create a coalition of people who might perceive themselves to be, this law to be used against them, but who are very powerful in terms of influencing the government. So it can be renegade monks, it can be political figures, it can be academics, it can be tuition masters, it can be anybody that you can create a fear or and make them understand that this law can be used against them. They can put impact on this particular government or any government, because it seems that they have an outsized influence on policy making in this country. And I think addressing them, creating a coalition, working, it's a very unholy alliance, and I dread whoever ventures into creating such an alliance, particularly maintaining it. I think you've got to do it, because for me, I anticipate that this law will become law as the elections, whatever election comes next, because I think any rational observer can see that the popularity of a government is declining very fast. And if you look at when countries went from talking about creating a law to really going ahead with it, it is when their electoral outcomes was at stake. And I think this is very clearly something that's going to happen in the next couple of years in this country. So I think that creation of that alliance needs to happen. And then when you have that alliance, not the alliance, when you have the alternative, right? You take the alternative to the tech giants and you tell them, look, we want to tackle this in our country, because even if you look at Facebook or any other social media platform, they understand that they played a part in the riots that happen in this country, and they have put in place certain mechanisms, and they are amiable to a conversation, because I've run both the trade chamber and a media chamber, and I had chats with digital giants over the years, and they don't want to come off as being irresponsible, but you need to understand their commercial interests. You need to understand they don't want to be governed by a particular law of a particular country. But they are willing to be a little bit more responsible than they are now, provided there is a mechanism that has been created by different stakeholders. What could that mechanism be? I'll tell you one piece of example. In about 2011 or 12, when I was running SLP, I realized the need that we needed to create a self-regulating mechanism for the electronic media. I know there have been others who've done it before, and they've tried to do it before that. So what I did was, rather than wasting time, doing a public, consultation on this, I realized that we needed to work on the owners, because they are the real, the powers at be. So I personally have spoken to a lot of these media stakeholders at that time, about 10 years ago. Everybody except one private media owner were amiable to creating such a mechanism, because I scared the daylights out of them in terms of what an outcome would be if there was a state-based one. Right? You would be surprised how many of these media moguls today agreed to do that, or at least consider moving towards that. It's a long way off, right? But there was one holdout, and that holdout was able to then break that whole, the momentum, because if that holdout was not coming, then the other private media was not coming, and then the state media, would not even consider that. So there was momentum, and I think even in 2000, I think the last few years, there was another movement towards that, and there was a creation of another. So I think the solution to winning from a technological perspective is, understanding that local laws are not going to have much impact from the truth getting out. Fake media, fake news being really tackled. But from a society perspective, we need to tackle it, and I think the tech giants would be more amiable if it was a self-regulatory kind of system that we brought to them. And I think that will also start creating the kind of opposition that is required to make sure that that bill doesn't get passed. I know I've consulted on one or two countries, stakeholders in one or two countries had the same problem. I think we worked on the same mechanism, and as far as I know, those two countries don't have the law, or the law got defeated or didn't ever make it to parliament. So I think there's enough of stakeholders who are scared that it will be used against them, who are powerful enough to create the outcome. I think we need to harness that also as a response, however unsavory that may be.
All right, thank you very much for that, Imran. I think we have been getting a lot of questions on the definition of fake news. Gehan, if you could just quickly give us a definition with regards to that.
I hoped I answered that question in my talk, but let me just reiterate what I mentioned earlier. I think we have to understand that fake news is just an umbrella term for lots of different things. And I referred to essentially disinformation and misinformation, because the feature of fake news, and I agree with some of the comments about the fact that fake news is a bit of an unwieldy term and we shouldn't be even using it. The essential division is disinformation and misinformation, because the feature there is that the information is false. Because you also have things like, I mean, people refer to malinformation, which is essentially the use of accurate or truthful information in a way that is harmful. I'm aware of sort of global definitions out there. Particularly, there's a definition that some researchers in Europe try to mainstream, where they used intent to cause harm as one of the main distinguishing features between disinformation and misinformation. I completely disagree with that approach, because I think trying to figure out intent when evaluating false content is very, very difficult, because a lot of it happens in the digital realm, and that doesn't work really. So it's much more viable and sustainable to separate disinformation from misinformation on the question of harm, because we can objectively evaluate whether something is going to cause harm or not. And if it's a discussion on the Loch Ness monster, regardless of the conspiracy theories out there, and I'm sure there are a few who'll be offended by this, that's misinformation, because we can objectively evaluate that information as not really going to cause harm. Maybe the person intends to cause harm, but we can't actually get into that. We have to be objective. So I think the division requires some re-evaluation. And there's a report a couple of years ago by Verity Research that actually went into this. And I thought, I haven't actually seen a good critique of these definitional parameters elsewhere. So it's useful for us also not to just take on definitions that are given to us, but be critical about it and think about how it actually applies in practice. Because most of the people in the media space, and I'm sure Roel will completely agree, that you can't assess people's intention. You really have to evaluate things objectively. So I think fake news is a term that we should be deviating from in the first place. Let's stick to disinformation. That's false content that can cause harm, and misinformation, which we should ignore most of the time, and really hone in on disinformation, because that is where the problem lies. But just to be very clear, I am all for having a robust conversation about how harmful disinformation is and having a response to it. Criminalizing is just one thing that is amongst lots of measures that we should be considering, and having this discussion where we hold even the platforms to account, to hold large media institutions to account. Roel brought up a really important point about media ownership, really asking for transparency without giving the state criminal law powers is the key here. And I think it's really important not to fall into these extremes where it's either criminal sanctions or nothing. I think we really need to find that balance. And I agree completely with Imran's comments about having that robust conversation, even in the tech world. I'll just pause there.
Okay, thank you. So I would we have about 10 minutes for the panelists to share a few thoughts on what was said previously, just before we move on to Q&A. So if you have any thoughts that you would like to share on what has been said so far, please, the floor is yours. Would anyone like to start? Or we can just move on to the Q&A straight away, whatever you're comfortable with.
I mean, I have a question for Roel, and I'm sure Bhavani has as well, but she's raised her hand first, so I'll let her start.
Thank you, Gehan. No, I think we need to have this conversation about why are we just going with what the government is putting out there? I mean, we are just responding to what they're putting out there. And the conversation really should be, what's the present situation? And do we need a law? I mentioned this very briefly. Lawmaking in Sri Lanka is so problematic. It's decided by, it's controlled, manipulated, decided by a few. So when you start having these conversations about laws and drafting laws, what should be in it. Really, it's a conversation we have, but it really doesn't inform, a lot of the times doesn't inform those who are going to actually be in control of that process. And in recent times, we've seen committee stage amendments being brought for even constitutional amendments that just wasn't even in the public domain. So I think when we talk about these things, the question really should be, how do we look at other, and this has come up, how do we look at other ways of addressing disinformation? But in terms of also, I think there's just kind of lack of clarity in terms of what we've been talking about, what is harmful, what is malicious. I mean, those are the things we should really be pushing at. And I think this is the big question, is everything is so politicized here. There will be responses because there is an opportunity to get some marks of arresting someone, of prosecuting someone, or passing a law because, you know, that's convenient. So we know that that's the context. So how do we then divert that conversation, be better prepared? And this whole thing about preparation, pushing the officials in terms of what their preparations are, in terms of what's happening now, but also asking key actors who can be more involved in the oversight. I think that's going to be key. From, I said parliament, but, you know, media institutions, what are they doing? What are the editors doing? What are the social media platforms doing? So let's broaden that conversation than just stick to the legalese, because that's also something I think we get stuck in.
I just have a quick question for Roel, and I think the conversation between the legal profession and the media industry and the sector is a really important conversation. But I've struggled with some of the developments that have taken place, particularly in Sri Lanka over the last 5 to 10 years, where the line between private media and state media is starting to blur. And for me, that's no longer an easy classification. Now you have private media doing the state's work. You don't really, there's no real bifurcation there. So in that context, how do we actually respond to private media that's actually taking on the role of the state? And I'm not referring to any particular media institution, because this happens whatever government is in power, because there are media institutions that obviously are more aligned to particular political parties, and they take turns, right? So this is not to point fingers. I think it's a problem that we're going to have to start thinking about, because that line is being blurred, and simultaneously the line between traditional media and social media is also being blurred, right? So private media actors that are sort of invested in sort of being the state's mouthpiece is also investing in social media, and that line is also being blurred. So I mean, I'd really like to hear what both Roel and sort of Imran have to say about that challenge, because I think the legal fraternity is catching up in terms of understanding that challenge.
I mean, this is something that has been discussed within the media industry for a while now. The fact that a lot of the private media is now doing a better job at representing the state's point of view and the state's agenda than the state media. So Rupavahini still has a lot of impact, but I would say it's being used less for agenda setting, or less for what's the word? Less for it's being used less than than private media that has obviously a stake. It's very powerful. First thing, I'm not going to name names, but we know at least 2 private media organizations that are very powerful, very strong, and very capable of setting out agendas. When it comes to what the media can do to deal with this, Gehan, the issue, I mean, practically there are problems with sorting it with solutions. But if I were to just talk about a solution in abstract terms, we are dealing with facts. Okay, news media deals with facts. So we deal with an incident and we deal with facts. Now, just because one media house or one media outlet goes there and decides to portray a certain, distort the facts or portray a certain side of the story, or there's some agenda going on there, doesn't mean that the facts don't exist. And it will be easy for an oversight, some kind of oversight board or a committee or whatever, to at the end of the day get down to the bottom of what happened, because we are just talking about an incident that unfolded. When it comes to news, we only report on incidents that unfold. The greater context, the deeper implications, all of these things come in during the analysis stage. But when as media, when you respond to an event or an incident that's unfolding. And if you are responding to an event and an incident that's unfolding in an unfair manner by adding, if you're a news reporter, you don't have the right to bring in your opinion. You don't have to have the right to cast any kind of aspersions on what the ethnic community you're responding to, or where the incident is. You get what I'm saying? It's very easy to point out what is being done wrong from just a media ethics point of view or media good practice point of view. But unfortunately, even though we're aware of what media ethics and what media good practice is, there's no enforcement. And again, this is a gray area, because we're talking about enforcement. Then we bring in the question of do we have state regulators, or do we have a media, like an independent, some sort of media watchdog from within self-regulation? So the problem is self-regulation, in my point of view, as a very much younger person in this bigger debate that has been, that has happened between editors for generations before me. My view here is that self-regulation seems more a response to state regulation than an actual solution. Self-regulation seems to have come about as a response to, oh, we don't want state regulation, so we're going to try and cobble together some kind of, I don't know, Imran, I'm really sorry if I'm work that was done before my time, but it just seems to me that it's a response or a solution that came about as a in response to the fear of state regulation, rather than a holistic approach to dealing with the issues. Because even if that were the case at the time, that hasn't carried on to where we are today. So even things like now the Editors Guild, for instance, this is a question that has also been raised. I am an editor. We've discussed the fact that Mandana Ismail is the editor of The Morning. Neither of us have, I mean, the last time I was asked this question, I wasn't even aware there was an Editors Guild. That is how impressive, how impactful they are. So my point is, within the industry itself, how self-regulation should be what's the word? Should be what constitutes self-regulation and how it's going to be implemented, who implements it. These are things that need to be discussed. I mean, we obviously need to be discussed, but how can we discuss it when a lot of us are left out of the conversation? So we have, like I was saying, the Editors Guild that exists as the primary organization or coalition of editors, but when some of us are excluded from it, some of us, are not even invited into these Editors Guilds, how can we have these discussions? What is the Sri Lanka Press Institute doing? What are the older people within the industry doing to bring in the younger people, bring in the people who are now a part of this, the media or representing the media to discuss these topics? One thing, and this is something Imran will agree with me on, there is no working together within the media industry. The media industry is so fractured, it's so fragmented, everybody is working against each other. It is not just the competition of getting the news out there. It's just not, I mean, I just don't see that social consciousness or that consciousness of an industry as a whole. And when you lose sight of the fact that you're supposed to be, as an industry, you have a role, as an industry, you're supposed to be doing something in society, when all of us practitioners don't see that as our primary duty or our primary civic duty, then where are we? We will only be forever responding to whatever is unfolding, in terms of an event and running to keep up with the news cycle. The news cycle dominates us, as opposed to us setting some sort of clear, again, the word agenda is what comes to mind, but it's not the best word. But the media has a role and a responsibility in shaping public conversation perception on certain events that unfold. So if there is no working or cohesion within the media industry itself, which is something that is very clear, then how we are going to have these conversations about self-regulation and how best to self-regulate is not going to happen. And yeah, from there, I don't know who's going to lead the conversation, but that's basically my contention.
Thanks.
Yeah, let me just add a couple of quick points. I don't know if you guys can hear me. Yeah, okay, thanks, Gehan. A couple of quick points. I completely agree with Roel that the media is in silos. I think the print guys are beyond a particular age, and have no interest in terms of reaching out to anybody under except 50. Somebody who's like 50 years younger than them, right? And that's extremely troubling. Number one. Number two is in terms of the blurring of the traditional media and social media. I think one of the most important things to do really among the general public is to create awareness of real impact, right? I'll give you an example. There's a newspaper. The newspaper is The Island. The Island has very little in terms of print, print reach. It's effectively very little, right? Some of the social media based journalists who have nothing but online presence have 10 times the reach of The Island, right? For example. However, the politicians who are also on the other side of 70 to 80 still remember The Island as a rebellious newspaper and read its ethnocentric content, and they still get influenced by it, right? The reason is because in their head, they don't really know the impact of the different types of media, right, social media or print media having in terms of the general population. I think that's something that we can work on in terms of creating. The younger politicians are very aware of who, what sort of impact the different platforms have, but not the older generation. So I think that's something that's one of the first things that we need to do in terms of creating, making the awareness of the impact that is happening. In Australia, they're trying to do this because in terms of Murdoch's impact on the print, right? He has a disproportionate control of it, but and therefore there are a lot of laws in Australia that were created in the 1990s to control impact. And if you want a print newspaper, you can't own a radio station and so on. They removed all of that recently, and there's a huge blurring of what's going on. One of the biggest insidious things that is happening in Australia that the general public is not aware of the impact of the newspaper-based columnist on the reach that they are getting on social media. So effectively, these laws are getting, abused, but the impact has not been measured. I think that's the second thing we need to work on is really creating awareness of the impact of different, platforms to the general public, politicians, anyone. That's the second thing we need to do. The third thing, which I'm very, very confident about, really is, amplifying the voices of regional journalists who have had a much bigger reach due to social media and digital this thing. I see Rifty, who is one of those young journalists who's having over his impact is much more in terms of any traditional media is having on social media. Then Azam comes to mind. His work for me. I know how many people go after him because they know the real impact that he has, right? So I think, and there's a very nice couple of journalists down south, right, who have been able to prove, right, with death certificates that the number of COVID deaths is much higher than what the government is admitting to. So I mean, those people are creating the kind of what I call a lot of smaller platforms, but have a big reach in the area of concern to them. Again, they are in silos. Now that's another problem we need to deal with, right? So they're in different parts of the country. They're in different. They know each other very well, but they are not really working together. So I think the bigger issue is about bringing these people who are working in silos together. I think, and they will have a far bigger impact going forward than any of these other initiatives that we're looking at. I think that's something we need to work on. And also coming just one more point about a regulator, right? I mean, or even a self-regulated body. None of these countries that have these 20 laws of criminal defamation really have come up with a body to kind of self-regulate either. right? The state just goes and uses the law to prosecute, but there is no, alternative that they have created either. So we could be one of the first in the world to create it, and then, take the model to other parts of the world as well. So I think something we can work on.
Thanks, Imran.
All right, thank you very much for that. So I think a couple of the questions were answered through that discussion. But Ms. Bhavani, I would like to pose a question to you. This was asked, so fake news during elections is a serious problem. I would like to know the best practices or laws in other jurisdictions regarding this, responsibility and powers of the Election Commission of Sri Lanka and other law enforcement authorities in addressing this specific issue.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, what we've seen here is that there is misinformation and falsehoods being seen during the election time. In Sri Lanka, we saw that in 2020, 2019. But, if you look at what happened with the US and Brexit, all of that, it's not just a local issue. I think there is a huge problem. Now, and then there are also, remember, vested interests that gain from these kind of campaigns. So one has to, when looking at the problem, also remember who is to gain from these things, and not be just limited to just the election cycle. Sometimes these campaigns build up way before. And I say this because in a few years, we are going to also have national elections, and keeping in mind things could already be in place building up to those things. And I'm not naming anyone, I'm just saying this is a reality that one needs to think about. And so if you think about Sri Lanka and what happened in 2019 with the Easter Sunday attacks and what we saw subsequent, the violence, the fear that was created, the incitement, all of this led to a particular result in November 2019. These are, I don't think these are accidents. What was the action taken by the authorities, including the Election Commission? I would say it was dismal. And so it led to a situation, and this I flagged before, there is complete impunity at this moment for misinformation and disinformation to happen in Sri Lanka. Is it just because there was no political will? Is it because we didn't have the proper resources? There are lots of arguments that can be raised, but I would say one thing. We've established the fact that there's sufficient laws. There are laws that are problematic, but there are laws. There are also action taken based on those laws on particular individuals. So again, the question is, it's not a lack of laws or lack of resources, because when it's convenient, it's being used. It's to ensure there's consistency and that laws are used in a transparent, uniform manner that doesn't just lead to a particular community or particular individual or particular group being targeted. So it's not the weaponizing, but ensuring there's a system in place. Unfortunately, what we have is very politicized ways of approaching incidents, approaching events. So let me just say this. It's not a lack of institutions or lack of laws. It's the fact how it's implemented or not implemented, or how it's abused and manipulated. And keeping in mind what's in store for us into the next couple of years, and keeping in mind what we saw just last year with the COVID response and how it was dealt with, individuals arrested, where questions were raised as to the legality, or some who were not arrested at all. I think those questions need to be asked right now in terms of how it's going to play out into the next elections. I'm just addressing election cycle, but election cycles don't just begin when a date is announced. It's a much bigger process. And one other aspect that I think needs mention is just the attacks The attacks on particular candidates, be it minorities, women, I mean, this is just horrendous what we are seeing. So fake news is part of this cycle. And so how do we also ensure there are standards in place that what we saw in 2019, 2020 doesn't continue to happen? And that's where those conversations need to start, not about just the legalese, but how do you have standards? How do you have implementation? And ensuring that there's some form of decency when we talk about these things. That's a huge problem in Sri Lanka.
Okay, thank you for that. Imran, I have a question for you. So how important is it to use language processing tools to counter fake news in the context of translations, given that most news are circulated in Tamil and Sinhala? And I think that question coupled with another one on the government proposed the need for strict monitoring of social media. So this may require certain resources and technologies which we don't have access to right now. How will the government afford this, and what kind of impact does it have?
I think the first question about the tools available. I think the tools are constantly getting better. It is far from satisfactory, right? But see today the fact that there is automatic translation in some of these, at least on the bigger social media channels, means that you can read context to some extent, but the translation itself is horrendous, and so therefore the context is not full, but it's much better than what it was before, right? That's number one. Number two is in terms of monitoring social media. I mean, what do you mean by monitoring, right? Now I'm aware that there is a concerted effort in terms of monitoring Sri Lankan diaspora, right? And also reporting them to these platforms, and when they comment on something. There's this hilarious situation of where there's a gentleman in London in front of Buckingham Palace wearing an outfit similar to the one worn by the LTTE, but what he is actually doing is he's commemorating the life of Prince Philip. Now, so our keyboard heroes or these monitoring people, whoever, right, reported him. The post was taken down. Then a London-based journalist who runs these online sites actually wrote to Facebook. So there is a relationship between obviously then him, therefore they take his word a little bit more seriously. And he pointed out that all he was doing, this gentleman, all he was doing was just commemorating Prince Charles. Philip, right? Even though his outfit looked a little similar, a lot similar to banned terrorist organization. So they re-looked at this. The content. I was talking Tamil, and they put the video back up again. The problem I see really is that these platforms are having, the content moderation is done by people who are particularly, who come from particular language streams, right? But the problem is, and if they're operating from Sri Lanka, then the problem that that arises is that they themselves have personal biases. And so, for example, what one word that they may think is quite acceptable within the country they live in may not be within Facebook's parameters. So that there is a problem in terms of content moderation, because the moderators themselves are human, right? There's a lot of automatic moderation going on, but at the same time, there's a lot of humans, particularly looking at Sri Lanka after all the riots happen, and those content moderators, but are biased themselves, right? And so I think you need to work a lot harder on them being trained first in anti-bias training, because they themselves are influencing the society they live in, and if they are moderating from Sri Lanka, right, whatever said and done, their views, to some extent, are influenced by the society and what they are exposed to itself. I think so. That needs to. I think the platforms need to work on that first. Whoever they hire needs to either be bilingual or they need to sort of do a lot of anti-bias training for them first. In terms of technology, it will keep improving. There's a lot of AI-based, moderation going on and language processing. Only problem with AI itself is biased, right? Because it depends on who built the platform. So I think we are working on that bias as well. I think from a global perspective, over time, it will get better. right? And in terms of the government, I think, again, it depends on the intent of the monitoring, right? If the intent of the monitoring is for prosecution, then the level of evidence that you need to gather is quite high, and therefore I think will require a lot of resources. But if you're targeting a handful of people and then monitoring them, I don't think you need much resources, and that's what's happening now. Right, not just in this country, but globally as well, of people, from this country who are there globally. So I think to answer that question, it depends on the intent of what that monitoring is. If it is like, China style, great firewall kind of monitoring, then you need massive resources, right? And I don't think we have that kind of, so it's a waste of time, energy, putting that kind of thing in place. So I think those are questions that the government needs to answer before they go in, right?
Thank you, Imran. So we have a final question for today. I would like to pose this to Roel. So considering the dissemination factor, would this mean that its effect would be more focused on large media stations and publications in comparison to individuals? Could this be a good thing to regulate the accuracy of information and accountability of many outlets, media outlets? And to promote the social disharmony with obvious reckless manipulation of information based on political and business biases.
So yeah, I'm not sure that I understood the question. What was the first bit?
So the question was considering the dissemination factor of media outlets and how it will affect large media stations and publications in comparison to individuals.
Okay, so I'm assuming the person asking the question is focusing on the fact that the paper that has been approved by the cabinet talks about the dissemination factor there. I'm assuming that that's what we're referring to. I don't know that just because the cabinet paper says dissemination or the distributors of fake news is the target means necessarily that big media organizations will come under scrutiny. And that's basically what I was saying earlier also. It doesn't seem like this piece of legislation, if it comes into force, is aimed at the media, except of course if there are people who are going to be very vocal against whatever government or whatever government is in power at that time. But we have a lot of these dissenting voices are already shut down. There aren't many dissenting journalists in Sri Lanka anymore. All of us have become very, very accustomed to self-censorship. If you think it's not just the media, of course, it's with its lawyers or activists. A lot of us have learned that there are things that we can't really be as critical as we want to, and we have learned it because of these tools that are used against other people. So when you look at all of the examples, whether it's Shaktika or Hijaz or Dr. Shafi, and then that was the media that completely went after him with a vendetta, Divayana. When you look at it, and again, with an agenda, when you look at it from that point of view, it's very clear that having a dissenting voice, standing against the powers that be, is not something that's going to be lightly taken. And it's this sort of thing that I would assume that this proposed piece of legislation is aimed at. But and it is not going to, I don't think it's going to be aimed at any big media houses, because the big media houses are hand in glove with a lot of, which is also something we discussed, hand in glove with people in power, and it's in their interest to stay hand in glove with these people. A lot of them invest money and airtime on during an election on both sides. Both parties, or both of the bigger parties, because they know that once people come into power, they can get what they want in return. And this is a big power game, and it's always been like this, and it's not anything new. But to answer that question very specifically, no, I don't think it's going to be used against big media houses at all.
Okay. Thank you. So just before we end our session, if any of our speakers would like to share any final thoughts regarding our session today, please feel free to do so.
Maybe a quick thought on our role as citizens. I think something that we really need to inculcate in citizenship discussions is that we need to develop a healthy skepticism of the state, a healthy one, not just irrational disbelief of the state, but a healthy one. And I think that attitude is ultimately what's going to hold any state to account. I think there's a good reason to believe that the Sri Lankan state has not acted in good faith when it comes to criminal law in Sri Lanka, and the examples are plenty. In that context, I think it is healthy to distrust the state with more criminal power. So I'll just end with that thought.
Can I come in? And I just want to thank again the organizer. I think this is a very good conversation, but it also shows that we are at very early stages in terms of thinking through, and we can't just wait for certain things to happen and then have the conversation. So it might also be good, and I agree with a lot of what has been said, is for all of us to, in our own capacities, to think through how do we take steps to protect the freedom we have. And I disagree slightly with Roel in terms of self-censorship among some, because I think there are those who are still very much pushing the boundaries in Sri Lanka. In very difficult circumstances, facing a lot of threats, but there are very few. How do we multiply that? How do we encourage younger generations to step up, for them to have the opportunities to ask difficult questions? So I'm heartened that this conversation is happening now in terms of younger people realizing these conversations are important. But we are going in for more difficult times. The repression is going to continue. And I think in that, hopefully, we look at things not just to respond, but a longer term conversation in terms of elections, in terms of rule of law, judiciary, parliament, all of that. And for that, I think hopefully there are more webinars that happen, but also hopefully we have a day where we can do this in person as well, because while we do these virtual events, it's sometimes very important that we also take a moment to recognize what we have been doing, what we need to be doing, but also be inspired with what has happened and what continues to happen. So there's some good work happening, and the more important thing is how do we continue to do that?
Yeah, just to, I've always been an optimist about Sri Lanka simply because of three reasons actually. Number one is that we've somehow found a way when we really hate governments, however powerful they think they are, to get rid of them, right? I don't know how we do it, how we can't get that courage, in front of overwhelming, pressure and whatever, to just go out there and actually change governments at very crucial times in our history. So I'm very positive. It's very difficult to get to that stage, but we do it. And that's something I find very interesting. Number two is technology. I mean, Roel alluded to the fact that a lot of the brave voices are not in Sri Lanka anymore. True, but some of those voices are still active. And then their voices are being spread globally through technology, and then they're getting it's getting reflected back into Sri Lanka. There's a very interesting question about what you can do about fake news or other news on these messaging platforms. Very little, sadly, right? Very little, because it's very difficult to go into every single message and kind of filter it out. Of course, WhatsApp and them have done things like how many you can only forward a message to a certain number of people, to that kind of thing you have done, but very little can be done for encrypted messaging apps. But that also means it's a very robust area for both fake news and robust conversation, right? And for me, I noticed that a lot of information comes back into Sri Lanka through those brave voices that are raising it overseas, through these apps, through these forwarding, as much as fake news does. So I think I'm a little bit more positive in terms of that. The third question is in terms of how do you build on structures. See, the Press Commission was supposed to be a self-regulatory body for the newspapers. During its different times, it has tried to expand, right? But the problem is it has expanded from a base of superiority of print versus the other platforms. I think that's where they have failed. And I think giving due recognition to the impact of different platforms and then bringing them together might be a better way to do this. And I hope the stakeholders. I'm obviously not part of the stakeholders now, though I'm aware of what's going on in terms of visibility. Just to add one more fact, because of the laws that were brought in the US, right? You can actually look at advertising on even Sri Lankan elections. I did this recently. A friend of mine showed me how much each of the candidates who are running to be president of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka actually spent on advertising for that particular election. Now, the thing is, to find it, you have to go into particular, Facebook has this particular platform, and we go and find how much he just spent, how much the people who have done for their campaign have spent. So there was a little bit of visibility, right? I used the information and showed it to one of the candidates who was one of my friends, and we were shocked at how much money was spent by the other candidate, and just to have a healthy conversation around on that, right? I think the tools are available because of global laws. It's a matter of looking at how we can find those tools and spread it out. I think that's something that we need to work on as well. And this bringing people together, this silos are the problem that we have in Sri Lanka, right? And I think that's something that the stakeholders need to work on very, very fast. It's not that difficult to break, right? All of us, Roel is the best example, right? She has morphed herself from print to digital to whatever, and she has friends all over the place, right? It's a matter of just bringing them together. But I think the issue is about respect and measuring impact. And I think that's something the industry itself has not done. I think that's something that they can do very quickly. If they don't, I don't think there's going to be much of a space left in terms of this is the final frontier. Digital is the final frontier, right? So each time print has been under siege, you move on to the radio was always basically monopoly, right? So then you have these music stations. They were not real radio stations, but you had electronic that didn't really stand up for themselves. Now you have digital. This is really the last frontier, and if you're going to make a stand, you've got to make it on digital plus all the others coming together at this moment. But I'm very hopeful about Sri Lanka. I don't know why I'm just optimistic about Sri Lanka.
Sumaya, I just want to say thank you for hosting this, and also, of course, to Students for Liberty and the Nightwatchman Society. Thanks for having this kind of discussion. And I agree with Bhavani, there are very, very few people still standing on the front lines, and not to them. I will also agree with what Gehan said. I believe very strongly in the role of the citizen. And when I say role of the citizen, each of us need to understand who we are and what we're doing. So whether it's Gehan as, I'll say very simply a lawyer, but the many things that he does, or whether it's Bhavani in her capacity, whether it's Imran in his, or you in yours, we all have something that we can do. And it's imperative, I think, that we recognize what we can do and do it. And it's becoming more and more imperative at a time like this, when it's up to us now to defend our freedoms. There was a time when we could just sort of leave it in the hands of, I don't know, other people. But it's just coming more and more to the point where it's us, the citizens itself, that have to get up and say something or do something. And like Imran said, it's time to maybe, and Bhavani said, moving from these sort of webinars and discussions online, trying to really figure out how we can bring this together from all of us, from the legal point of view, from media's point of view. How can we bring this together and sort of actually work on something that will provide a solution to this before the state gets involved? So that's something to think about.
All right, thank you very much. So that brings us to the end of our discussion. Thank you very much for a very insightful and interesting discussion to all the speakers, and Thank you for taking your time this evening. We would also like to thank our audience for today and our host, Sri Lanka Students for Liberty. You can find more information on their Facebook page and the Nightwatchman Society, who will be hosting their next book club session on the 27th of May, where they will be discussing the narrow corridor, states, societies, and the faith of liberty. If you would like to register, send an email to info@nightwatchmansociety.org. Thank you all again for joining us. Have a great night.